He sold over 100 million records. He performed on every major stage on earth. He made women throw hotel room keys at his feet, and grown men stop in their tracks and admit, quietly, that the voice was something they had never heard before and would never hear again. He was the most electrifying live performer of his generation. And behind every performance, behind 60 years of stages and sold-out arenas and hit records, and a fame so large it became a kind of weather system, was a marriage he would not discuss, a secret he would not share, and a private life so deliberately hidden that the world that worshipped him never once got close to the real man. The singer who made millions feel everything turned out to be the man who showed the world almost nothing. Have you ever built something extraordinary on a foundation you were afraid to examine too closely? Have you ever stood at the center of a story the world was telling about you and known, quietly, that the most important parts of the story were the ones no one was allowed to see? That question is at the heart of Tom Jones, and what it reveals, when you finally look at it directly, is something the highlights reel never showed. It is 1965. The Ed Sullivan Show, New York City. Tom Jones walks to the microphone. He is 25 years old. He is from a coal mining valley in South Wales. He has never been to America before. He opens his mouth. He sings. The studio audience, composed of women who came prepared to be polite, who had seen performers before, who were not expecting to be undone by a young man from Pontypridd, loses its collective composure in approximately 45 seconds. It's Not Unusual is #1 in 14 countries. Tom Jones is, in the space of a single television appearance, a star on both sides of the Atlantic. And in the audience, or watching at home, or hearing about it secondhand, no one knows that this 25-year-old international sensation had a wife, had a 4-year-old son, had married at 16, in secret, to a girl he had gotten pregnant in a small terraced house in the Welsh valleys, had built his entire adult life on a foundation that the image his management was constructing required to stay invisible. He was not Tom Jones from Pontypridd with a wife and a child. He was Tom Jones, the phenomenon, the sex symbol, the available fantasy. This story is about both of those things, because you cannot understand the performer without understanding the price the performance extracted from the people who lived inside the private life he refused to let the world see. Go back far enough from the Ed Sullivan Show and the knicker throwing and the Las Vegas residencies and the 60 years of hits, and you find a street in Treforest, Pontypridd, in the Rhondda Valley of South Wales. Row after row of terraced houses, colliery slate gray sky, men who went underground for a living, women who waited above ground, managing everything the mine left behind. Thomas John Woodward was born on June 7, 1940, in that world. His father, Thomas Woodward Sr., was a coal miner. His mother, Freda Jones, kept the house and kept the family together with the practical, undemonstrative love of women who had learned that love was a verb, not a declaration. He was a sickly child. Tuberculosis at age 12 kept him out of school for 2 years and confined to bed for long stretches. During that time, the long, housebound months of illness, he listened to music. American music, mostly, the blues, gospel, country sounds that bore no obvious relationship to a terraced house in the Welsh valleys and that felt, to the boy listening, like transmissions from a life that was larger and more colored than the one currently containing him. He recovered. He went back to school. He discovered, somewhere in the process of becoming well again, that his voice had changed in the way that some voices change, not incrementally, not gradually, but completely. What emerged from the illness was a baritone of extraordinary richness and range. A voice with a quality that the boys around him didn't have, and that the music he had been consuming during convalescence seemed to have been waiting for. He sang wherever he could find an audience. Local clubs, working men's pubs, the social clubs that were the entertainment infrastructure of the South Wales valleys. He was, from the beginning, the kind of performer who needed the reaction, who fed on the attention of a room and gave it back amplified and transformed. He was also, from very young, the kind of young man who attracted the attention of women. Specifically, of one woman, Linda Trenchard, who lived on the same street, who was the same age, and who was, by every account of those who knew them then, the person he actually loved. He was 16. She was 16. She was pregnant. They married in March 1957 in a registry office in Pontypridd. She was 7 months pregnant. He was 16 years old. The ceremony was not celebrated with the kind of announcement that marriages between teenagers in South Wales in 1957 typically involved. Which is to say, it was not celebrated at all. It was a quiet registry office, a witness, a signature. It was done. Their son, Mark Woodward, was born in April 1957. Thomas John Woodward was 16 years old. He had a wife. He had a son. He had no money and no prospects beyond the local clubs where he sang on weekends for small payments. And the possibility, the distant, unlikely, everything has to go right, possibility that the voice might eventually carry him out of the valley. Have you ever made a commitment at an age when you were too young to fully understand what commitment meant, and then spent your entire life honoring it and evading it simultaneously? That question follows Tom Jones from Treforest to London to Las Vegas and into the long, ambiguous terrain of a marriage that lasted 60 years and that neither partner ever fully explained. The voice did carry him out of the valley, but the path was not direct, and the early years were brutal in the specific way that the gap between obvious talent and commercial opportunity is brutal when there is no money to cushion the waiting. He played the clubs. He formed bands with names that said everything about where they were from and nothing about where they were going. He recorded demos that went nowhere. He worked whatever work came his way: construction, glove factory work, a period working on a building site with his father-in-law while Linda managed the house and cared for their son on an income that did not expand to absorb ambition. The early years of their marriage were, by the account of those who lived them, genuinely hard. Not hard in the romantic sense that biographical retrospection tends to apply to the humble origins of famous people. Hard in the actual sense, money running out before the month did, a child needing things, a wife managing the gap between what her husband dreamed and what the household required, a man spending evenings in working men's clubs, singing to audiences who paid attention when they felt like it, and talked among themselves when they didn't. There is a version of that period that Tom Jones has discussed in interviews with affection, with the nostalgia that success lends to difficulty once the difficulty is safely in the past. But the person who lived that period most entirely, without the eventual compensating glory, was Linda. She was 16 when she married him. She was 17 when she became a mother. She had not signed up for the hardship with a contract that guaranteed eventual reward. She had signed up for a man she loved, in a valley where men married young and women managed what came after, and she was managing. The break came, as breaks tend to come, through a combination of talent, timing, and the right person being in the right room at the right moment. Gordon Mills, a songwriter and would-be manager from the same South Wales background as Tom, saw him perform at a pub in London in 1963. He had come from the same place. He heard something in that voice that the local clubs of Pontypridd had been hearing for years, and that London, he believed, was ready for. He heard correctly. Mills became his manager. He moved Tom to London full-time. He renamed him, discarding Woodward, the father's surname, the coal miner's surname, in favor of Jones after the Welshness it carried, the Tom Jones of Henry Fielding's 18th century novel, the suggestion of a man with appetite and history and a story worth telling. He began the careful, strategic work of building an image around the voice. The image required a particular kind of man. A man who was vital and available and unencumbered. A man who suggested possibility. A man who did not, at 24 years old, have a 7-year-old son and a wife in a house in South Wales. Linda did not come to London immediately. She stayed in Wales. Then, she joined him. Then, they found a house, a life, a new geography for a marriage that was now operating in a world completely different from the one in which it had been formed. It's Not Unusual was recorded in 1964. It was released in January 1965. By February 1965, it was #1 in the United Kingdom. Tom Jones was famous, and Gordon Mills made a decision, or perhaps Tom Jones made the decision, or perhaps they made it together, in the way that managers and their clients sometimes make decisions about which parts of the truth are commercially viable that the wife and the child would not be part of the story the press was told. Tom Jones was presented to the world as available, unattached, a virile, vital force of nature without domestic complications. The image required it. The market, they believed, demanded it. Linda Woodward became Linda Jones and moved into a large house in Surrey and was, for the purposes of Tom Jones's public persona, essentially invisible. What the world was watching and what was happening inside the private life of Tom Jones were, from 1965 onward, two entirely different stories. There is a version of Tom Jones's story that the public was permitted to see for the first 2 decades of his career. The performances, the hits, Green, Green Grass of Home, Delilah, What's New Pussycat, Thunderball, the television series, This Is Tom Jones, which ran from 1969 to 1971, and which brought his performing style, the movement, the voice, the explosive physical presence that made even casual viewers understand immediately why audiences reacted the way they did into living rooms across America and Britain and beyond. He was, by any objective measure, one of the most compelling live performers in the world. He had what the industry calls it that indefinable quality that makes an audience watch and keeps them watching. That creates the experience of personal connection across a distance of 50 rows that makes the woman in the cheap seats feel somehow specifically addressed. He was funny, warm, self-aware without being ironic. He was genuinely present on a stage in a way that a lot of performers who can carry a note cannot manage. Las Vegas understood him before almost anywhere else understood him properly. The Caesars Palace residencies that ran from the late 1960s became, for a generation of American audiences, a definition of what live entertainment could be. He sold out night after night. The stories of what happened in the audience during those performances became their own genre: the hotel room keys, the underwear, the spectacle of women who had come to see a show and found themselves doing things they could not entirely account for afterward. He also had, during this period, a pattern of personal conduct that was entirely consistent with the image the machine had constructed and entirely inconsistent with the vows he had made in a registry office in Pontypridd in 1957. He was not faithful to Linda. By his own later admissions, careful, undramatic admissions that came only after she was gone and could no longer be hurt by them by the accounts of the people around him during that period. By the simple arithmetic of a man at the center of a fame that brought constant and aggressive opportunity and a management apparatus that actively built his image around availability, he was not faithful. The affairs were numerous and, in some cases, sustained and documented. Marjorie Wallace, Mary Wilson, names that surfaced and were reported and were managed and subsided. The names that never surfaced were, by all accounts, far more numerous than the ones that did. Linda Jones, in the large house in Surrey, knew some of it, perhaps all of it. She was not the kind of woman who demanded explanations she didn't want, or confrontations that would only confirm things she already understood. She was the woman who had loved him when he was Thomas Woodward of Treforest, when the only stage was a working men's club on a Friday night, and the only audience was men who had come underground that morning. She had been with him before The Voice had a market, before Gordon Mills had given him a new name. Before any of it, she stayed. Have you ever watched someone you love construct a version of themselves for the world that left you outside the frame and chosen? For reasons too complicated to explain even to yourself. To stay anyway? That choice repeated, renewed, decade after decade, is the hidden spine of this story, and it demands to be understood as something more than simple forgiveness. It was a form of commitment so total and so private that it outlasted everything the public version of Tom Jones ever produced. The first public crack appeared not from within the marriage, but from outside it, from a DNA test, a court case, and a child Tom Jones had not acknowledged. In 1987, a woman named Catherine Berkery filed a paternity suit in the United States. She alleged that Tom Jones was the father of her son, Jonathan, born in 1988. Tom Jones initially denied the claim. He denied it publicly, through legal representatives, with the firmness of a man who had spent 20 years carefully managing the distance between his public image and his private conduct. The DNA test was conclusive. Jonathan Berkery was Tom Jones's son. He did not, following the confirmation, acknowledge Jonathan publicly as his son. He did not establish a relationship. He paid child support through legal channels. Jonathan Berkery grew up largely estranged from his father, a man who was, by the time Jonathan was born, one of the most famous singers in the world. Jonathan spoke about the estrangement in interviews. Over the years, he described attempts at contact. He described the specific pain of being the son of a famous man who treated fatherhood as a liability to be managed rather than a relationship to be inhabited. Tom Jones's response, across the years that followed, was characteristically private. He acknowledged the paternity. He did not expand on it. He directed his representatives to handle the legal obligations. He did not appear at Jonathan's side at events. He did not speak about him with the warmth he reserved for Mark, the son who had grown up inside the household, the son who eventually became his manager. There are two sons in this story. One was acknowledged and loved and brought into the center of his father's professional life. The other existed at the legal periphery of it. That is not a detail. That is a character. And the man at the center of that detail, the man who made millions of strangers feel seen and felt and understood through his voice, chose, for 40 years, not to look directly at it. The story's most significant reckoning arrived not in a courtroom but in a hospital room. On April 10, 2016, Linda Jones died of lung cancer. She was 75 years old. They had been married for 59 years. She had been his wife since 1957, through the fame and the affairs and the houses in Surrey and Los Angeles and Las Vegas, through the hits and the periods of commercial decline and the revivals, through every version of Tom Jones that the public had seen, and through all the versions the public hadn't. He was at her bedside. He has described the moment, in the careful language of a man unused to speaking about the private center of his life, as devastating. As the thing from which he did not know whether he would recover. As the removal of the one constant in a life whose surface had been defined by constant change. In the aftermath of her death, something shifted in how he spoke publicly. Not dramatically. Not with the confessional openness of a man suddenly unburdened, but differently, with a quality of honesty that his interviews had not previously contained. He said that he had not been a good husband. He said that the affairs had been real and numerous, and that Linda had known about them and had stayed anyway. He said that he had not understood, for most of their marriage, what she was giving him by staying. He said that he had understood it, finally, and then she was gone. He said he missed her in a way that made everything else smaller. Have you ever realized what something was worth only after the moment of realizing it coincided with the moment of losing it? That particular form of grief, the grief that carries the specific weight of late understanding, is the most honest thing Tom Jones ever said in public, and he said it only when she was no longer there to hear it. There is an accounting that needs to be made here. Not as judgment, that is not what this story is for, but as clarity. Because the story of Tom Jones cannot be told honestly without naming what was lost in the private life while the public life was being constructed. Linda Jones spent 59 years married to a man whose management team treated her existence as a commercial inconvenience. She spent decades in houses that were large and well-appointed and entirely defined by her husband's career. She raised their son largely without the sustained daily presence of a father who was, at any given time, in Vegas or LA or London or on a tour bus somewhere between them. She knew about the affairs. She absorbed them. She stayed. She did not, for most of her marriage, receive public acknowledgement. No interviews. No profiles. No appearance beside her husband on the red carpet, or the talk show couch, or the magazine cover. She was the woman in the Surrey house. She was the woman the machine required to be invisible. And she was, by every account of people who knew her, not invisible at all. She was funny, sharp, direct in the way of Welsh women of her generation, without sentimentality about herself, and without illusions about the man she had married. She had loved him at 16 in Treforest, and she loved him at 75 in Los Angeles, and the love had never required the world to see it to be real. The central irony of Tom Jones's life is this: the man whose voice communicated raw, immediate, unguarded feeling to hundreds of millions of people was, in the private life that voice was protecting, among the most guarded men in show business. The instrument of intimacy he carried on every stage was also the instrument that made the concealment economically viable and therefore sustainable. He sang everything. He showed nothing. And then she died. And he finally started talking. In 2026, Tom Jones is 85 years old. He lives primarily in Los Angeles, where Linda spent her final years and where the house they shared has become, by every account, a place he keeps in the way that people keep the spaces where the people they loved once lived. His son Mark manages his affairs, as he has for decades, the coal miner's son's son making a life from the career his mother enabled by staying. His grandson Alex Jones has worked in the same orbit. He still performs. Fewer dates, more carefully selected. He released an album, Surrounded by Time, in 2021 when he was 80 years old, and it debuted at #1 in the United Kingdom, making him the oldest solo male artist to reach that position in British chart history. The voice is different at 85 than it was at 25. It carries more of what happened to the man. The rasp is deeper, the power is more concentrated, less demonstrative. It knows things. He speaks about Linda in interviews with a directness and a grief that is, for those who have followed his public life across 6 decades, genuinely striking. He has said that he talks to her, that he feels her presence, that the bed is wrong without her. He says these things plainly, without performance, and they are more affecting than anything he said in 60 years of arranged celebrity interviews. There is something quietly, profoundly moving about the image, an 85-year-old man, one of the most famous performers in the history of popular music, sitting in a house in Los Angeles, talking to the wife who was invisible for 59 years and who turned out to be the only audience he ever needed. He is still learning how to say it. He is still trying. Tom Jones' story is not a story about music. It is not a story about the voice, extraordinary as the voice is. It is not a story about the hits, or the residencies, or the television shows, or the extraordinary revival that brought him back to #1 at the age of 80. It is a story about the gap between the life you perform for the world and the life you actually live, about the specific and irreversible cost of treating the people who love you as components of an image rather than as ends in themselves, about what happens when the machinery of fame requires concealment as a condition of its operation, and about what is left when the machinery finally stops and the concealment is no longer necessary, and you look at what the concealment cost. He cost Linda Jones 59 years of invisibility. He cost Jonathan Berkery a father. He cost himself, by his own reckoning, the understanding of what he had while he still had the chance to show it. We build images around the parts of ourselves that the world finds desirable, and we protect the parts that complicate the image. We do it individually, and we do it on a scale. Tom Jones did it, which is to say with the full resource of a management apparatus and a commercial machine, and the result is always the same. The things we protect by hiding them are diminished by the hiding, and the things we refuse to acknowledge don't disappear. They accumulate. They wait. They present their bill when we are 80 years old and alone in a house in Los Angeles, and the woman who saw through everything and stayed anyway is no longer there to stay. What are you protecting by hiding? What would change in your relationships, in the lives of the people who love you if you let it be seen? Leave that in the comments. Because that is not a question about celebrity. That is a question about the arithmetic of love. And the answer matters more than any song Tom Jones ever recorded. If this story moved something in you, if it reflected something in your own life or the life of someone you love, leave a like. It takes 1 second, and it means this story reaches someone who needs it. Subscribe. There are more stories like this one lives that looked one way from the stage and were something else entirely from the wings. And tell me in the comments, what is the one thing from this life that you will carry with you? Because the greatest performance Tom Jones ever gave was not at the Ed Sullivan Show, and it was not in Las Vegas, and it was not on any stage the world ever saw. It was in a hospital room in Los Angeles in April 2016, when nobody was watching. We'll be back.